Generative AI is here, and it has changed the rules of the game. Experts like Seth Godin and Robert McKee have been very clear. The authors who are going to make it in this business are those who are writing truly amazing, knock your socks off innovative stories. The bar is that high. AI will replace mediocre writers. But at some point, everybody is mediocre. So what do? You educate yourself. And the good news is that there's still time, but you've got to start leveling up right away. I'm Valerie Francis, and I've got a series of webinars to help you do just that. My specialty is helping authors like you put theory into practice. Understanding the tools of our trade and being able to apply them with precision is no longer an option. It's an absolute necessity. So go to valeriefrancis.ca/webinars for more information and sign up for the notifications. You can't afford not to. If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched Boy in the Striped Pyjamas so that we can study world building. This 2006 film was directed by Mark Herman from a screenplay by Mark Herman based on the book by John Boyne. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And we would love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. You know the drill. Say it with me. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. How did you get on with your study of world building this week?
Well, it was, I deliberately chose this movie to explore the historical world building, but also a story that was told really from a child's point of view. So they were the things that I wanted to look at and draw out this week as we watched The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, because it's not a happy movie by any stretch, and it can leave you feeling, it still leaves me feeling incredibly
Bummed out,
sad and upset. Probably not as bad as Manchester by the Sea, but, in terms of the outcome, it's a real gut punch every time I watch it. And I know that it's coming, but it still doesn't reduce the horror of what happens in the end. But but I was really interested in the historical world building from a time perspective, but also a child's point of view. Now, I know that last week we studied Big, and, that had a sort of a boyish type of protagonist. But The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas is different because, the protagonist is situated in Nazi Germany during the Second World War. So I'm proposing that this story requires a lot more world building just because of the historical context. Now, I also understand that the book and the movie were very controversial when they were released due to the allegorical nature of the story, and that neither are historically correct. But I have to say I have not read the book, and so I'm only going to comment on the world building in the movie, and there may be differences, but I'm not aware of them. Now, my study of world building this season has been very focused on worlds that are based on our primary world, or secondary worlds that are very close to our primary world. And The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas is set in the secondary world of Germany during World War II. Now, I've identified this world, or the world of the story, as a secondary world because it is removed from the primary world, so our current reference point, because it's set about 80 years in the past. And so it's not as familiar to us as the world that we currently live in and walk around every day. Now, the world is familiar in some way because we understand the historical setting and the historical context. and we comprehend the differences in the story world compared to our primary world, again, which is our reference point. So we're not operating from a completely clean slate. Now, if you've been following along this season, you'll know that I've put forward the idea in episode 3 that the stories we've studied are built in worlds that use 3 main setting types. Now, I've been tracking this through the season, not only in the movies that we've been watching, but also in the fictional books that I've been reading as well. Now, there are some variations or exceptions to this pattern, but I can say with a level of confidence that there is a nugget of truth in the pattern of 3 types of settings that reoccur in stories. Now, this pattern is repeated in The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. So, as a guide, Bruno's world plays out in, first of all, his home, his front yard, and the concentration camp. Now, there are more specific locations within these settings. So, for example, in the home, there are scenes in the kitchen, the dining room, and the kids' bedrooms. Now, the room types provide the variety for each of those settings, and so do the characters and objects that fill those settings. But the so what of this, or the so what about this general rule of 3 locations in a story world is that you can use this to plan your story and build your world depending on the story that you're telling. And I think that this is a good foundational piece of information to have, right? That if you can think about 3 locations or 3 types of settings, you are starting to look at how can you build that world for your character and start to think about that, but also then start to think more specifically about the who and the what you will put into those settings and what to fill those 3 types of world settings with. I hope that makes sense. So, and to extend that out even further, here are sort of 5 topics I think that will guide you in your world building in a close to normal world using a sort of a 3 setting type of rule as well. So the first is you have to really look at the world of the protagonist. And what I mean by that is in episode 2, I mentioned that the story world is a subjective world and it's a subjective world of the protagonists. Therefore, we must consider who the protagonist is and how that will impact how they see the world. The second topic would be looking at the supporting characters. So they give the protagonist other people to interact with and to react to within that world. The third is the surroundings. So that is what is in the world that the characters respond to with their senses. So it's very specific to the sensory world that they're existing in, and again, very subjective. Then there's something to think about. The fourth point is society and culture. So what are the symbols or commonly understood things that we are going to use to orientate the reader in a time or a place or a type of culture that they are in? And then finally, looking at the setting and the landscape. So this is more about the larger geography of the story. So for historical fiction stories, these would be historical locations. And also, if you were going really into science fiction and fantasy, that is something that you would really use to create new worlds. It's probably not as strong in historical fiction unless it's really very different from what you would expect the mainstream audience to have experienced. All right, so let's look at The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas using these points. So the subjective world of the protagonist is the first point. So point of view is really important in this movie and in the world building. We see the story through Bruno as the point of view character. So if the world is subjective, then it must be consistent with the way an 8-year-old experiences that world. Now, this happens in the movie, or we understand Bruno's point of view because of the dialogue in the film. You know, Bruno believes and states out loud that the concentration camp is a farm and that the people on the farm wear pajamas. And he can't understand why Shmuel is so hungry. And he honestly believes that Shmuel spends most of his days playing because of the way that he believes or perceives the world, and he believes what the adults tell him. Now, the world is subjective and must be consistent with Bruno's 8-year-old experiences in it. And that is why Bruno comes across as naive. He's also privileged and he is protected. And the world that he lives in supports that and supports that point of view of his character. Now, for Bruno, this is a story where he is on the cusp of losing his innocence, and he may start to see what's happening inside and outside the world of his home. And therefore, the home will be an important place where parts of the story are told. Now, Bruno's understanding of the type of man his father is an excellent example of how Bruno is on the verge of seeing the world differently. In the beginning, Bruno's father's role as an army officer has the family living in a lovely, warm home in an urban area. You know, the kids go to school, they have friends over. And we first see his father in civilian attire, right? And he presents as we'd expect any loving father would present. And there is no indication that Bruno's father's work or the work world of his father intrudes into the home, because the home is actually filled with servants and not men in uniform. Now, this changes when Bruno's father is promoted to the position of the commandant at the concentration camp, and the new family home is surrounded by a brick wall, and there are far more scenes with bars and fences and gates, and also the colours inside the home are also colder. And the commandant's home is surrounded by guards with dogs, and we see more army men, and there are more restrictions on where Bruno and Gretel can go. And, you know, we also start to see the introduction of Pavel as a Jewish slave or a Jewish prisoner entering into that home world as well. And as the story progresses, Bruno wants desperately to hold on to the idea that his father is a good man. Even after his father allows Pavel to be beaten to death in the house, and his father sends Lieutenant Kotler to the Eastern Front, Bruno still holds on to the idea that his father is overseeing a holiday camp with fun amenities for the Jews. So really, Bruno very much holds on to that and wants his father to be a good man. And probably he doesn't step over that edge or that cusp into really understanding what is going on around him. And that is very much in tune with maintaining that 8-year-old point of view in the world building, in my opinion. All right, let's look at the supporting cast of characters. Now, because this is a children's movie, to really drive home the innocence of the children and the tragedy of the ending, Shmuel is a character who is the opposite of Bruno in every way. But what makes this movie powerful is the similarity between the two boys' ages, you know, the care they have for their fathers and the games that they play. And the contrast between Bruno and Shmuel's lives is also very apparent because we are aware of how different their circumstances are. But it's Bruno's naivety and his longing to see his father as a good man that blinkers him from understanding the differences in his and Shmuel's circumstances. And now this brings me to the other characters in the film and how they contribute to the world building. You know, we see Gretel, Bruno's sister, and she represents the young person's adaptation or adoption of the Hitler Youth policies or ideology. We see Bruno's grandmother, who is representative of the portion of the German population that resists the Nazi Party agenda. Bruno's grandfather is a believer in restoring, the strength of the fatherland to its former glory, and he supports Bruno's father's role as the commandant of the camp. Bruno's mother, Elsa, is strangely naive about the camp and what goes on there. And I think she really represents the portion of the world who tried to ignore what was really going on until the point where she couldn't. And there's Bruno's father, who I think is perhaps the most complex character presented in the movie, because he represents the father figure who Bruno loves, as well as the men who are really responsible for the atrocities of the Holocaust. And he's also an SS officer, which is not overtly stated, but it's there on his uniform. And then there's also Lieutenant Kotler, who is a cruel but obedient junior officer whose Bruno's father sends to the Eastern Front after Kotler discloses that his father left Germany to avoid fighting. Now, this also highlights, or Kotler's role is to highlight Bruno's father's hypocrisy because his own mother is anti-Nazi. But this supporting cast of characters create friction and conflict around Bruno, but the conflict isn't always between Bruno and the other characters. So their roles in this world of the movie are very clear, and all of the characters are necessary to create a full world for Bruno as well. So it's a really interesting choice of how they've created those characters and what it is that they represent in Bruno's world, to him as an 8-year-old, but then also outwardly towards the audience. Right, now, let's look at Bruno's surroundings. And this is where that idea of the 3 types of settings, I think, really comes into play. At the start of the movie, Bruno's world is very small or protected, and it doesn't really have many physical boundaries. But by changing where that world is located, the writers are creating a space to add to or change certain story elements. And in Bruno's world, the change in home introduces the Nazis' objectives for the Second World War, as well as his father's support of the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi Party. Now, Bruno's world then extends out into the yard and then past the house to the forbidden world of the concentration camp. Now, this is the first movie where we've come across a part of the world that's forbidden, but it is a common feature in children's stories. The forbidden part of the world will often be a place of either great discovery and reward, or a place of treachery and death. Now, however, the safe place of the home in this story has actually been infiltrated by the insidious Nazi policies. And Bruno is exposed to Nazi propaganda when Herr Liszt is brought in to instruct him and Gretel, and also that full brutality in the home when Kotler beats Pavel during the dinner scene. So we really see the way the spaces are used to bring the external into the personal places of that Bruno is comfortable and familiar with. And it starts to create a feeling of, or remove a certain level of safety for him. Now, each of these settings in Bruno's world exposes Bruno to his father's role in implementing the Nazi Party's final solution. And because it's a cautionary tale, the forbidden part of the world then results, or is the place where Bruno and his friend Shmuel die. So I really love looking at the places in this movie and looking at how that plays out and creates the space for the world and the rest of the story. Now, let's look at the society and culture in Bruno's world. So the boy in the striped pajamas, in the opening shot, it starts with the Nazi flag, and we see children running and playing, and a Berlin courtyard cafe with people in 1930s or 40s clothing and we also see German army uniforms. Now, Bruno runs through a group of soldiers who are rounding up Jews and forcing them into a truck, but he is blissfully unaware of what is going on. Now, establishing the story's setting in Germany during World War II early in the film means that all other references to Nazi policy, the army officers, the treatments of Jews, and the concentration camps don't need extensive explanation. So the audience understands the historical setting of the story before any real action starts to take place. And then if we look at Bruno's home, his front yard, and the concentration camp, so those three main setting areas, then they sit nested within this larger society and culture, and they are the more specific locations where the action of the story takes place. And now that I think about it, establishing the broader location first has been really consistent across all the films that we've analysed this season. So in District 9, which was set in an alternative Johannesburg, that gave it the association with apartheid, so that didn't necessarily need to be explained in a great way. Contemporary New York has featured in 4 of the movies this season, but the specific settings have been very different and very specific to the subjective world of the protagonists as well. So it's something that's really, I'm very excited about this. This is something that's really helpful. And I think when you're setting your story up, it's something that you can potentially use if you don't know how to start world building or think about world building in the, a near close to normal world. And finally, in my analysis, there's the setting and the landscape. So there's not too much detail to add here because we are very familiar with when and where the story is set. However, the further away your story is from the primary world, the more time you will have to spend thinking about setting up the landscape and how to communicate the geographical differences to your reader so that they know that they are in a different world. But in summary, the world building in this historical movie is established by 3 types of setting. And then there's very specific choices about who fills the rest of those scenes and the events that occur in those. And in this case, the home is invaded by the external forces of evil in the world, and the forbidden part of the world really is the place that plays out to the inevitable conclusion that we would expect of a cautionary tale, and ends in the children's deaths. Oh, very sad. Valerie, how did you go with Bruno's character this week?
Yeah, this is a really chipper sort of movie. Not. Well, actually, a lot of the things that you talked about are things that I've picked up on as well. And I always find it interesting when this happens. To be honest, there's not a huge amount to talk about with respect to Bruno's character because he doesn't really have an arc. He certainly doesn't change. And I think that's the point. I don't see that as a flaw in the storytelling at all. In fact, I think it enhances the storytelling. Bruno's character is revealed to us, of course. We know that he likes adventure books and that he likes to explore. He sees himself as an adventurer, and that's why he thumbs his nose at authority from time to time. For example, he ventures into the backyard even though his mother tells him not to. He tells the tutor when it's time to stop lessons. And when his 12-year-old sister flirts with Kurt, Lieutenant Kotler, he calls her out for acting older than she is. But his primary characteristic is that he's innocent. He is a pure soul. He's immature, and I think, Melanie, you used the word naive, same thing, and he stays that way. In fact, his whole function is to represent our collective innocence and how the war killed it in us. He represents all of the innocent and good people who were killed senselessly. So, how do we know that Bruno is innocent? Well, he's a kid, for starters, yes, but that doesn't automatically follow that simply because he's a child, he's innocent. So, the audience needs more. So, the filmmakers give us these things. Bruno doesn't read newspapers and therefore has no idea what's happening with the war or the reality of his father's job. He sees the concentration camp and thinks it's a farm. He thinks the prisoners are farmers who wear striped pajamas and that the numbers on these pajamas are part of a game. He sees the film about the concentration camp and believes that it's real. And he also believes that his father is doing some good to help the Jewish people. He puts the prisoner clothes on and enters the camp, completely unaware of the danger that he's putting himself in. Now we know he's immature as well because he's initially jealous of Shmuel. He thinks it's unfair that Shmuel is in the camp with a lot of friends and he's outside of the camp with no friends. When questioned by Kotler, Bruno claims that he doesn't know Shmuel and that he didn't give the food to Shmuel. We know that Bruno has an innate sense of goodness because he befriends Shmuel in the first place, and he stays his friend even after he discovers that Shmuel is Jewish. He talks to Pavel. He feeds Shmuel because Shmuel is literally starving. He realizes that he should have told the truth when questioned by Kotler, and he offers to help Shmuel find his father. He wants to make it up to his friend for having betrayed him. Now, we see Bruno starting to have some sense of awareness that all is not what it seems, but only after he's inside the concentration camp. Just before they go into the building, they run past a series of stones, a distinct pattern of stones. And he recognizes them from the propaganda film that he watched. But he doesn't have time to reflect upon it because Shmuel calls him into the building. Now, it's possible that Bruno achieved a sense of awareness when the gas was released, but then again, he could also have remained innocent of what was actually happening to him. All of that is happening behind closed doors, so we don't really know if at any point he had any awareness of what was happening. There's really only one point in the film when Bruno is under serious pressure. And that's when Kotler walks in and catches him talking to Shmuel, and Shmuel is eating the treat. So what he does in this moment is the only time where his true character is revealed. So what does he do? He betrays Shmuel, and as a result, Shmuel gets a right beating from Kotler. But Bruno knows that what he's done is wrong, and he's torn up over it. So he tries to make it up to Shmuel by helping him find his father. So what does that act tell us about Bruno? Well, all this whole thing, it reveals that Bruno's a kid. His behavior is cowardly because he's immature, and Kotler is very terrifying, and he is an adult. Bruno doesn't yet have the maturity to stand up to someone like that. But it also tells us that he's a good person because he tries to right the wrong. Now, Melanie, like you, something that I found very interesting this week were the other characters. I think they're developed very nicely. So I just want to take a couple of minutes and go through them. I'm putting Shmuel and Pavel kind of in the same group because they are both genuinely victims. They both live in the concentration camp, and they're both being treated horribly by the Nazis. Yet, when they are under pressure, both of them find it in their hearts to forgive. And Shmuel is forgiving Bruno for having betrayed him. And Pavel is finding it in his heart to help Bruno, even though he is the son of a senior Nazi official. And just like you, Melanie, I picked up also on the idea that Shmuel is the foil for Bruno, which is beautiful. And when you have a character who's a foil, the function in a story, what it does is like foil on the back of a mirror, or, it enhances the protagonist. It sort of lights him up a little bit and makes his characteristics a bit bolder, makes them stand out a little more so that the reader or viewer has a even better idea of who the main character is. I like foil characters. I think they're interesting. Then we have Elsa, who's Bruno's mom. She's a good woman. If a little naive, she is a good woman. And we can see that she is the influence of good in Bruno's life. When she discovers that the Nazis are burning Jews, and of course, she knows then that it's her husband who's responsible for this, she wants nothing more to do with him. She will not even let him touch her. She will not accept it, and she cannot justify it even during wartime. This is the woman who thanked Pavel for helping Bruno. It's also the woman who begs her husband, Ralph, the senior SS soldier, to go to Pavel's rescue when Kotler is attacking him during the dinner scene that Melanie talked about a few minutes ago. Then we have Ralph, who's Bruno's father. Now, like you, Melanie, I thought he was by far the most interesting character. He's driven by a sense of duty. On the one hand, he's responsible for countless deaths because he's the one sending the Jews to the gas chamber. And we even see a scene of him looking at sort of the new improved chambers and how many more people they can fit in them. Oh my God, it's horrifying. However, on the other hand, he's also a loving father and husband. It's clear that he loves his children. Every single scene with the children, he is shown as a loving father. He's also a loving husband. When Elsa screams, "Get away from me, don't touch me," he gets away from her. He doesn't touch her. He listens. When Elsa says, "I'm taking the kids and getting out of here and you can't stop me," actually, yeah, he can. He has that authority, but he doesn't. He supports her in her decision to take the children and leave that home and the concentration camp. And of course, that means that he may not see his family ever again, certainly not for a very long time. So he's putting his family's needs ahead of himself. Now, the contradiction in traits, right, that he can kill a lot of people. He's a murderer on one hand, but on the other hand, a loving father and husband. This contradiction in traits is what Robert McKee calls a dimension. The more dimensional a character is, the more interesting he is, and the more story that we as writers can pull and entice out of them. So, for the main character in a novel, you want maybe 3 to 5 dimensions. So that's sets of conflicting traits. Although, listen, that is very much a guideline. Very much a guideline. You can have as many as you want. If you have too few, you're going to run out of story. And I know when we did 10 Things I Hate About You, we talked about this. When your characters are flat, in other words, they have no dimension and they are who they appear to be, you run out of things to say about them. You run out of things for them to do in the story, and the story lags and is dull and boring. And so what we tend to do then is add more characters and more plot lines to try and beef up the story a little and get it all the way to 80,000 words. So you definitely want to have a few dimensions or sets of conflicting traits like we have here with Ralph. 3 to 5 dimensions would certainly be enough to sustain a novel. But for a long film, or certainly for long form TV, which runs about 10 times the length of a novel, they tend to be about 100 hours. The average length of a novel, if you listen to audiobooks, is about 10 hours. So long form TV is about 10 times the length of a novel. You need a protagonist with a whole lot more than 5 dimensions, because otherwise you're not going to get 100 hours of storytelling out of it. Tony Soprano, and these numbers come from Robert McKee, he's done this analysis. Tony Soprano, by his estimation, has 12 dimensions. 12 sets of conflicting traits. But that's nothing to Walter White, who has 16 dimensions or 16 sets of conflicting traits. Fascinating, fascinating stuff. And of course, in his book Character, he goes into all of this in a whole lot more detail. Bottom line for us here today, though, is to think about your character, your main character. Don't worry about anybody else for now. Just start with your main character and ask yourself, what are the contradictions in that character? Do they have any? Are they, for example, both a killer yet a loving family member? Are they, say, a lawyer who cheats? As Jesse Pinkman says, you don't want a criminal lawyer. You want a criminal lawyer. That's a great line. So that's it, really. There's not a huge amount to say about Bruno, who's the protagonist this week, except that he doesn't change. And I think that's the point. I think it's intentional. I think it serves the story. He represents innocence, virtue, goodness, and doing the right thing. And of course, that's why he dies. Now, the movie does end really abruptly. I think if they'd extended the film to 2 full hours, because it's only about an hour and a half, and in that extra time, if they had shown Bruno in the camp for any longer, then he certainly would have had an arc, because he would have cottoned on to what was going around him. He would have matured really fast. But they chose to end it minutes after Bruno enters the camp. He goes under the fence, and Schmoll calls him away, and like they're running, literally running through the camp. Bruno sees the rocks. Schmoll calls him into the house, into the little hut, and they start looking for Schmoll's father, and then in comes the guard and gathers them up and takes them to the chamber. And that's as long as Bruno is in the camp. The screen time, the running time is real time. So it's minutes. So that's kind of it, Melanie. What have you got for the action step this week?
All right. This week's action step is how you describe your story's world will depend on the point of view of your character. So the character's state of mind and emotional response will affect how they see the world, but also how you describe it to your audience. So pick a scene, choose your character's emotional state, and write a description of the scene. Do the same again, but this time change the emotional state of the character. Now look at how the world is different, but also how it's the same, even with those different lenses.
And that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Pretty Woman. We're ending the season on a high note. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Threads @Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to get Melanie's tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit her on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about her at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.